Jack slept all the time. Mrs. Weldon, leaving him on Nan's knees, then descended toward the strand. Dick Sand and his companions followed her. The question was to see if the state of the sea then would permit them to go as far as the Pilgrim's hull, where there were still many objects which might be useful to the little troop. The rocks on which the schooner had been wrecked were now dry. In the midst of the debris of all kinds stood the ship's carcass, which the high sea had partly covered again. That astonished Dick Sand, for he knew that the tides are only very moderate on the American seashore of the Pacific. But after all, this phenomenon might be explained by the fury of the wind which beat the coast. On seeing their ship again, Mrs. Weldon and her companions experienced a painful impression. It was there that they had lived for long days, there that they had suffered. The aspect of that poor ship, half broken, having neither mast nor sails, lying on her side like a being deprived of life, sadly grieved their hearts. But they must visit this hull before the sea should come to finish demolishing it. Dick Sand and the blacks could easily make their way into the interior, after having hoisted themselves on deck by means of the ropes which hung over the Pilgrim's side. While Tom, Hercules, Bat, and Austin employed themselves in taking from the storeroom all that might be useful, as much eatables as liquids, the novice made his way into the arsenal. Thanks to God, the water had not invaded this part of the ship, whose rear had remained out of the water after the stranding. There Dick Sand found 4 guns in good condition, excellent Remingtons from Purdy and Co.'s factory, as well as 100 cartridges, carefully shut up in their cartridge boxes. There was material to arm his little band and put it in a state of defense if, contrary to all expectation, the Indians attacked him on the way. The novice did not neglect to take a pocket lantern, but the ship's charts, laid in a forward quarter and damaged by the water, were beyond use. There were also in the Pilgrim's arsenal some of those solid cutlasses which served to cut up whales. Dick Sand chose 6, destined to complete the arming of his companions, and he did not forget to bring an inoffensive child's gun, which belonged to little Jack. As to the other objects still held by the ship, they had either been dispersed or they could no longer be used. Besides, it was useless to overburden themselves for the few days the journey would last. In food, in arms, in munitions, they were more than provided for. Meanwhile, Dick Sand, by Mrs. Weldon's advice, did not neglect to take all the money which he found on board, about $500. That was a small sum, indeed. Mrs. Weldon had carried a larger amount herself, and she did not find it again. Who, then, except Negoro, had been able to visit the ship before them and to lay hands on Captain Hull's and Mrs. Weldon's reserve? No one but he, surely, could be suspected. However, Dick Sand hesitated a moment. All that he knew and all that he saw of him was that everything was to be feared from that concentrated nature, from whom the misfortunes of others could snatch a smile. Yes, Negoro was an evil being, but must they conclude from that he was a criminal? It was painful to Dick Sand's character to go as far as that. And meanwhile, could suspicion rest on any other? No, those honest Negroes had not left the grotto for an instant, while Negoro had wandered over the beach. He alone must be guilty. Dick Sand then resolved to question Negoro, and, if necessary, have him searched when he returned. He wished to know decidedly what to believe. The sun was then going down to the horizon. At that date he had not yet crossed the equator to carry heat and light into the northern hemisphere, but he was approaching it. He fell then, almost perpendicularly to that circular line where the sea and the sky meet. Twilight was short, darkness fell promptly, which confirmed the novice in the thought that he had landed on a point of the coast situated between the Tropic of Capricorn and the equator. Mrs. Weldon, Dick Sand, and the blacks then returned to the grotto, where they must take some hours' rest. "The night will still be stormy," observed Tom, pointing to the horizon laden with heavy clouds. "Yes," replied Dick Sand, "there is a strong breeze blowing up. But what matter at present? Our poor ship is lost, and the tempest can no longer reach us." "God's will be done," said Mrs. Weldon. It was agreed that during that night, which would be very dark, each of the blacks would watch turnabout at the entrance to the grotto. They could, besides, count upon Dingo to keep a careful watch. They then perceived that Cousin Benedict had not returned. Hercules called him with all the strength of his powerful lungs, and almost immediately they saw the entomologist coming down the slopes of the cliff, at the risk of breaking his neck. Cousin Benedict was literally furious. He had not found a single new insect in the forest, no, not one, which was fit to figure in his collection. Scorpions, scolopendras, and other myriapods, as many as he could wish, and even more, were discovered. and we know that Cousin Benedict did not interest himself in myriapods. It was not worth the trouble, added he, to travel 5 or 6 thousand miles to have braved the tempest, to be wrecked on the coast, and not meet one of those American hexapods, which do honor to an entomological museum. No, the game was not worth the candle. As a conclusion, Cousin Benedict asked to go away. He did not wish to remain another hour on that detested shore. Mrs. Weldon calmed her large child. They made him hope that he would be more fortunate the next day, and all went to lie down in the grotto, to sleep there till sunrise, when Tom observed that Negoro had not yet returned, though night had arrived. "Where can he be?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "What matter?" said Bat. "On the contrary, it does matter," replied Mrs. Weldon. "I should prefer having that man still near us." "Doubtless, Mrs. Weldon," replied Dick Sand, "but if he has forsaken our company voluntarily, I do not see how we could oblige him to rejoin us. Who knows but he has his reasons for avoiding us forever." And taking Mrs. Weldon aside, Dick Sand confided to her his suspicions. He was not astonished to find that she had them also, only they differed on one point. "If Negoro reappears," said Mrs. Weldon, "he will have put the product of his theft in a safe place. Take my advice. What we had better do, not being able to convict him, will be to hide our suspicions from him and let him believe that we are his dupes." Mrs. Weldon was right. Dick Sand took her advice. However, Negoro was called several times. He did not reply. Either he was still too far away to hear, or he did not wish to return. The blacks did not regret being rid of his presence, but, as Mrs. Weldon had just said, perhaps he was still more to be feared afar than near. And moreover, how explain that Negoro would venture alone into that unknown country? Had he then lost his way, and on this dark night was he vainly seeking the way to the grotto? Mrs. Weldon and Dick Sand did not know what to think. However it was, they could not, in order to wait for Negoro, deprive themselves of a repose so necessary to all. At that moment the dog, which was running on the strand, barked aloud. "What is the matter with Dingo?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "We must, indeed, find out," replied the novice. "Perhaps it is Negoro coming back." At once Hercules, Bat, Austin, and Dick Sand took their way to the mouth of the river. But arrived at the bank, they neither saw nor heard anything. Dingo now was silent. Dick Sand and the blacks returned to the grotto. The going to sleep was organized as well as possible. Each of the blacks prepared himself to watch in turn outside. But Mrs. Weldon, uneasy, could not sleep. It seemed to her that this land so ardently desired did not give her what she had been led to hope for, security for hers, and rest for herself. Chapter 15. Harris. The next day, Apith Austin, who was on guard at sunrise, saw Dingo run barking to the little river. Almost immediately Mrs. Weldon, Dick Sand, and the blacks came out of the grotto. Decidedly, there was something there. "Dingo has scented a living creature, man or beast," said the novice. "At all events it was not Negoro," observed Tom, "for Dingo would bark with fury." "If it is not Negoro, where can he be?" asked Mrs. Weldon, giving Dick Sand a look which was only understood by him. "And if it is not he, who then is it?" "We are going to see, Mrs. Weldon," replied the novice. Then, addressing Bat, Austin, and Hercules, "Arm yourselves, my friends, and come." Each of the blacks took a gun and a cutlass, as Dick Sand had done. A cartridge was slipped into the breech of the Remingtons, and, thus armed, all four went to the bank of the river. Mrs. Weldon, Tom, and Actaeon remained at the entrance of the grotto, where little Jack and Nan still rested by themselves. The sun was then rising. His rays, intercepted by the high mountains in the east, did not reach the cliff directly, but as far as the western horizon, the sea sparkled under the first fires of day. Dick Sand and his companions followed the strand of the shore, the curve of which joined the mouth of the river. Their Dingo, motionless, and as if on guard, was continually barking. It was evident that he saw or scented some native. And in fact, it was no longer against Negoro, against its enemy on board the ship, that the dog had a grudge this time. At that moment, a man turned the last plane of the cliff. He advanced prudently to the strand, and, by his familiar gestures, he sought to calm Dingo. They saw that he did not care to face the anger of the vigorous animal. "It is not Negoro," said Hercules. "We cannot lose by the change," replied Bat. "No," said the novice. "It is probably some native who will spare us the ennui of a separation. We are at last going to know exactly where we are." And all four, putting their guns back on their shoulders, went rapidly toward the unknown. The latter, on seeing them approach, at first gave signs of the greatest surprise. Very certainly, he did not expect to meet strangers on that part of the coast. Evidently, also, he had not yet perceived the remains of the Pilgrim, otherwise the presence of the shipwreck would very naturally be explained to him. Besides, during the night the surf had finished demolishing the ship's hull, there was nothing left but the wrecks that floated in the offing. At the first moment the unknown, seeing four armed men marching toward him, made a movement as if he would retrace his steps. He carried a gun in a shoulder belt, which passed rapidly into his hand, and from his hand to his shoulder. They felt that he was not reassured. Dick Sand made a gesture of salutation, which doubtless the unknown understood, for, after some hesitation, he continued to advance. Dick Sand could then examine him with attention. He was a vigorous man, 40 years old at the most, his eyes bright, his hair and beard gray, his skin sunburnt like that of a nomad who has always lived in the open air, in the forest, or on the plain. A kind of blouse of tan skin served him for a close coat, a large hat covered his head, leather boots came up above his knees, and spurs with large rowels sounded from their high heels. What Dick Sand noticed at first, and which was so, in fact, was that he had before him, not one of those Indians, habitual rovers over the pampas, but one of those adventurers of foreign blood, often not very commendable, who are frequently met with in those distant countries. It also seemed, by his rather familiar attitude, by the reddish color of a few hairs of his beard, that this unknown must be of Anglo-Saxon origin. At all events, he was neither an Indian nor a Spaniard. And that appeared certain, when in answer to Dick Sand, who said to him in English, "Welcome," he replied in the same language and without any accent. "Welcome yourself, my young friend," said the unknown, advancing toward the novice, whose hand he pressed. As to the blacks, he contented himself with making a gesture to them, without speaking to them. "You are English?" he asked the novice. "Americans," replied Dick Sand. "From the south?" "From the north." This reply seemed to please the unknown, who shook the novice's hand more vigorously, and this time in very American manner. "And may I know, my young friend," he asked, "how you find yourself on this coast?" But at that moment, without waiting till the novice had replied to his question, the unknown took off his hat and bowed. Mrs. Weldon had advanced as far as the steep bank, and she then found herself facing him. It was she who replied to this question. "Sir," said she, "we are shipwrecked ones whose ship was broken to pieces yesterday on these reefs." An expression of pity spread over the unknown's face, whose eyes sought the vessel which had been stranded. "There is nothing left of our ship," added the novice. "The surf has finished the work of demolishing it during the night." "And our first question," continued Mrs. Weldon, "will be to ask you where we are." "But you are on the sea-coast of South America," replied the unknown, who appeared surprised at the question. "Can you have any doubt about that?" "Yes, sir, for the tempest had been able to make us deviate from our route," replied Dick Sand. "But I shall ask where we are more exactly. On the coast of Peru, I think." "No, my young friend, no. A little more to the south. You are wrecked on the Bolivian coast." "Ah," exclaimed Dick Sand. "And you are even on that southern part of Bolivia which borders on Chile?" "Then what is that cape?" asked Dick Sand, pointing to the promontory on the north. "I cannot tell you the name," replied the unknown, "for if I know the country in the interior pretty well from having often traversed it, it is my first visit to this shore." Dick Sand reflected on what he had just learned. That only half astonished him, for his calculation might have, and indeed must have, deceived him concerning the currents, but the error was not considerable. In fact, he believed himself somewhere between the 27th and the 30th parallel, from the bearings he had taken from the Isle of Pax, and it was on the 25th parallel that he was wrecked. There was no impossibility in the Pilgrims, having deviated by relatively small digression, in such a long passage. Besides, there was no reason to doubt the unknown's assertions, and, as that coast was that of Lower Bolivia, There was nothing astonishing in its being so deserted. "Sir," then said Dick Sand, "after your reply, I must conclude that we are at a rather great distance from Lima." "Oh, Lima is far away, over there in the north." Mrs. Weldon, made suspicious first of all by Negoro's disappearance, observed the newly arrived with extreme attention. But she could discover nothing, either in his attitude or in his manner of expressing himself, which could lead her to suspect his good faith. "Sir," said she, "without doubt my question is not rash. You do not seem to be of Peruvian origin." "I am American as you are, madam," said the unknown, who waited for an instant for the American lady to tell him her name. "Mrs. Weldon," replied the latter. My name is Harris, and I was born in South Carolina. But here it is 20 years since I left my country for the pampas of Bolivia, and it gives me pleasure to see compatriots." "You live in this part of the province, Mr. Harris?" again asked Mrs. Weldon. "No, Mrs. Weldon," replied Harris. "I live in the south on the Chilean frontier, but at this present moment I am going to Atacama in the northeast." "Are we then on the borders of the desert of that name?" asked Dick Sand. "Precisely, my young friend, and this desert extends far beyond the mountains which shut off the horizon." "The desert of Atacama," repeated Dick Sand. "Yes," replied Harris. "This desert is like a country by itself, in this vast South America, from which it differs in many respects. It is, at the same time, the most curious and the least known portion of this continent." "And you travel alone?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Oh, it is not the first time that I have taken this journey," replied the American. "There is, 200 miles from here, an important farm, the farm of San Felis, which belongs to one of my brothers, and it is to his house that I am going for my trade. If you wish to follow me, you will be well received, and the means of transport to gain the town of Atacama will not fail you. My brother will be happy to furnish them." These offers, made freely, could only prepossess in favor of the American, who immediately continued, addressing Mrs. Weldon. "These blacks are your slaves." And he pointed to Tom and his companions. "We have no longer any slaves in the United States," replied Mrs. Weldon, quickly. "The North abolished slavery long ago, and the South has been obliged to follow the example of the North." "Ah, that is so," replied Harris. "I had forgotten that the War of 1862 had decided that grave question. I ask those honest men's pardon for it," added Harris, with that delicate irony which a Southerner must put into his language when speaking to blacks. "But on seeing those gentlemen in your service, I believed—" "They are not and have never been in my service, sir," replied Mrs. Weldon gravely. "We should be honored in serving you, Mrs. Weldon," then said old Tom. "But, as Mr. Harris knows, we do not belong to anybody. I have been a slave myself, it is true, and sold as such in Africa when I was only 6 years old. But my son Bat here was born of an enfranchised father, and, as to our companions, they were born of free parents." "I can only congratulate you about it," replied Harris in a tone which Mrs. Weldon did not find sufficiently serious. "In this land of Bolivia also we have no slaves. Then you have nothing to fear, and you can go about as freely here as in the New England states." At that moment, little Jack, followed by Nan, came out of the grotto rubbing his eyes. Then, perceiving his mother, he ran to her. Mrs. Weldon embraced him tenderly. "The charming little boy," said the American, approaching Jack. "It is my son," replied Mrs. Weldon. "Oh, Mrs. Weldon, you must have been doubly tried, because your child has been exposed to so many dangers. God has brought him out of them safe and sound, as he has us, Mr. Harris," replied Mrs. Weldon. "Will you permit me to kiss him on his pretty cheeks?" asked Harris. "Willingly," replied Mrs. Weldon. But Mr. Harris's face, it appeared, did not please little Jack, for he clung more closely to his mother. "Hold," said Harris, "you do not want me to embrace you. You are afraid of me, my good little man." "Excuse him, sir," Mrs. Weldon hastened to say. "It is timidity on his part." "Good, we shall become better acquainted," replied Harris. "Once at the farm, he will amuse himself mounting a gentle pony, which will tell him good things of me." But the offer of the gentle pony did not succeed in cajoling Jack any more than the proposition to embrace Mr. Harris. Mrs. Weldon, thus opposed, hastened to change the conversation. They must not offend a man who had so obligingly offered his services. During this time, Dick Sand was reflecting on the proposition which had been made to them so opportunely to gain the farm of San Felis. It was, as Harris had said, a journey of over 200 miles, sometimes through forests, sometimes through plains. A very fatiguing journey, certainly, because there were absolutely no means of transport. The young novice then presented some observations to that effect, and waited for the reply the American was going to make. "The journey is a little long indeed," replied Harris, "but I have there, a few hundred feet behind the steep bank, a horse which I count on offering to Mrs. Weldon and her son. For us, there is nothing difficult, nor even very fatiguing in making the journey on foot. Besides, when I spoke of 200 miles, it was by following, as I have already done, the course of this river. But if we go through the forest, our distance will be shortened by at least 80 miles. Now, at the rate of 10 miles a day, it seems to me that we shall arrive at the farm without too much distress." Mrs. Weldon thanked the American. "You cannot thank me better than by accepting," replied Harris. "Though I have never crossed this forest, I do not believe I shall be embarrassed in finding the way, being sufficiently accustomed to the pampas. But there is a graver question, that of food. I have only what is barely enough for myself while on the way to the farm of San Felis." "Mr. Harris," replied Mrs. Weldon, "fortunately we have food in more than sufficient quantity, and we shall be happy to share with you." "Well, Mrs. Weldon, it seems to me that all is arranged for the best, and that we have only to set out." Harris went toward the steep bank, with the intention of going to take his horse from the place where he had left it, when Dick Sand stopped him again, by asking him a question. To abandon the sea-coast, to force his way into the interior of the country, under that interminable forest, did not please the young novice. The sailor reappeared in him, and either to ascend or descend the coast would be more to his mind. "Mr. Harris," said he, "instead of traveling for 120 miles in the desert of Atacama, why not follow the coast? Distance for distance, would it not be better worth while to seek to reach the nearest town, either north or south?" "But my young friend," replied Harris, frowning slightly, "it seems to me that on this coast, which I know very imperfectly, there is no town nearer than 300 or 400 miles." "To the north, yes," replied Dick Sand, "but to the south?" "To the south," replied the American, "we must descend as far as Chile. Now, the distance is almost as long, and in your place, I should not like to pass near the pampas of the Argentine Republic. As to me, to my great regret, I could not accompany you there." "The ships which go from Chile to Peru, do they not pass then in sight of this coast?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "No," replied Harris, "they keep much more out at sea, and you ought not to meet any of them." "Truly?" replied Mrs. Weldon. "Well, Dick, have you still some question to ask Mr. Harris?" "A single one, Mrs. Weldon," replied the novice, who experienced some difficulty in giving up. "I shall ask Mr. Harris in what port he thinks we shall be able to find a ship to bring us back to San Francisco." "Faith, my young friend, I could not tell you," replied the American. "All that I know is that at the farm of San Felis we will furnish you with the means of gaining the town of Atacama, and from there—" "Mr. Harris," then said Mrs. Weldon, "do not believe that Dick Sand hesitates to accept your offers." "No, Mrs. Weldon, no, surely I do not hesitate," replied the young novice. "But I cannot help regretting not being stranded a few degrees farther north or farther south. We should have been in proximity to a port, and that circumstance, in facilitating our return to our country, would prevent us from taxing Mr. Harris's goodwill." "Do not fear imposing upon me, Mrs. Weldon," returned Harris. "I repeat to you that too rarely have I occasion to find myself again in the presence of my compatriots. For me, it is a real pleasure to oblige you." "We accept your offer, Mr. Harris," replied Mrs. Weldon, "but I should not wish, however, to deprive you of your horse. I am a good walker." "And I am a very good walker," replied Harris, bowing. "Accustomed to long journeys across the pampas, it is not I who will keep back our caravan. No, Mrs. Weldon, you and your little Jack will use this horse. Besides, it is possible that we may meet some of the farm servants on the way, and, as they will be mounted, well, they will yield their horses to us." Dick Sand saw well that, in making new objections, he would oppose Mrs. Weldon. "Mr. Harris," said he, "when do we set out?" "Even today, my young friend," replied Harris. The bad season commences with the month of April, and it is of the utmost importance for you to reach the farm of San Felice first. Finally, the way across the forest is the shortest, and perhaps the safest. It is less exposed than the coast to the incursions of wandering Indians, who are indefatigable robbers. Tom, my friends, replied Dick Sand, turning to the blacks, it only remains for us to make preparations for departure. Let us select, then, from among the provisions on hand, those which can be most easily transported, and let us make packs, of which each will take his share. Mr. Dick, said Hercules, if you wish, I shall carry the whole load very well. No, my brave Hercules, replied the novice, it will be better for us all to share the burden. You are a strong companion, Hercules, then said Harris, who looked at the Negro as if the latter were for sale. In the markets of Africa, you would be worth a good price. I am worth what I am worth, replied Hercules, laughing, and the buyers will only have to run well if they wish to catch me. All was agreed upon, and to hasten the departure, each went to work. However, they had only to think of feeding the little troop for the journey from the seacoast to the farm, that is to say, for a march of 10 days. But before setting out, Mr. Harris, said Mrs. Weldon, before accepting your hospitality, I beg you to accept ours. We offer it to you with our best wishes. I accept, Mrs. Weldon, I accept with eagerness, replied Harris gaily. In a few minutes our breakfast will be ready. Good, Mrs. Weldon. I am going to profit by those 10 minutes to go and get my horse and bring it here. He will have breakfasted, he will. Do you want me to go with you, sir? Asked Dick Sand. As you please, my young friend, replied Harris. Come, I shall make you acquainted with the lower course of this river. Both set out. During this time, Hercules was sent in search of the entomologist. Faith, Cousin Benedict was very uneasy indeed about what was passing around him. He was then wandering on the summit of the cliff in quest of an unfindable insect, which, however, he did not find. Hercules brought him back against his will. Mrs. Weldon informed him that departure was decided upon, and that, for 10 days, they must travel to the interior of the country. Cousin Benedict replied that he was ready to set out, and that he would not ask better than to cross America entirely, provided they would let him collect on the way. Mrs. Weldon then occupied herself, with Nan's assistance, in preparing a comfortable repast, a good precaution before setting out. During this time, Harris, accompanied by Dick Sand, had turned the angle of the cliff. Both followed the high bank over a space of 300 steps. There, a horse, tied to a tree, gave joyous neighing at the approach of his master. It was a vigorous beast, of a species that Dick Sand could not recognize. Neck and shoulders long, loins short, and hindquarters stretched out, shoulders flat, forehead almost pointed. This horse offered, however, distinctive signs of those races to which we attribute an Arabian origin. You see, my young friend, said Harris, that it is a strong animal, and you may count on it not failing you on the route. Harris detached his horse, took it by the bridle, and descended the steep bank again, preceding Dick Sand. The latter had thrown a rapid glance, as well over the river as toward the forest which shut up its two banks, but he saw nothing of a nature to make him uneasy. However, when he had rejoined the American, he suddenly gave him the following question, which the latter could little expect. Mr. Harris, he asked, you have not met a Portuguese named Negoro in the night? Negoro, replied Harris, in the tone of a man who does not understand what is said. Who is this Negoro? He was the cook on board, replied Dick Sand, and he has disappeared. Drowned, perhaps, said Harris. No, no, replied Dick Sand. Yesterday evening he was still with us, but during the night he has left us, and he has probably ascended the steep bank of this river. So I asked you, who have come from that side, if you had not met him. I have met nobody, replied the American, and if your cook has ventured alone into the forest, he runs a great risk of going astray. Perhaps we shall overtake him on the way. Yes, perhaps, replied Dick Sand. When the two returned to the grotto, breakfast was ready. It was composed, like the supper of the evening before, of alimentary conserves, of corned beef, and of biscuit. Harris did honor to it, like a man whom nature had endowed with a great appetite. Let us go, said he. I see that we shall not die of hunger on the way. I shall not say as much for that poor devil of a Portuguese, of whom our young friend has spoken. Ah, said Mrs. Weldon, Dick Sand has told you that we have not seen. Negoro again. Yes, Mrs. Weldon, replied the novice. I desired to know if Mr. Harris had not met him. No, replied Harris. So let us leave that deserter where he is and think of our departure. Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Weldon. Each took the pack which was intended for him. Mrs. Weldon, assisted by Hercules, placed herself on the horse, and the ungrateful little Jack, with his gun strapped on his back, straddled the animal without even thinking of thanking him who had put that excellent beast at his disposal. Jack, placed before his mother, then said to her that he would know how to lead the gentleman's horse very well. They then gave him the bridle to hold, and he did not doubt that he was the veritable head of the caravan. Chapter 16. It's on the way. It was not without a certain apprehension. Nothing seemed to justify it, however, that Dick Sand, 300 steps from the steep bank of the river, penetrated into the thick forest, the difficult paths of which he and his companions were going to follow for 10 days. On the contrary, Mrs. Weldon herself, a woman and a mother, whom the perils would make doubly anxious, had every confidence. Two very serious motives had contributed to reassure her. First, because this region of the Pampas was neither very formidable on account of the natives, nor on account of the animals which were found there. Next, because, under the direction of Harris, of a guide so sure of himself as the American appeared to be, they could not be afraid of going astray. Here is the order of proceeding, which, as far as possible, would be observed during the journey. Dick Sand and Harris, both armed, one with his long gun, the other with a Remington, kept at the head of the little troop. Then came Bat and Austin, also armed, each with a gun and a cutlass. Behind them followed Mrs. Weldon and little Jack on horseback, then Nan and Tom. In the rear, Actaeon, armed with the fourth Remington, and Hercules with a hatchet in his belt, closed the march. Dingo went backwards and forwards, and, as Dick Sand remarked, always like an uneasy dog seeking a scent. The dog's ways had visibly changed since the Pilgrim's shipwreck had cast it on the seacoast. It seemed agitated, and almost incessantly it kept up a dull grumbling, rather lamentable than furious. That was remarked by all, though no one could explain it. As to Cousin Benedict, it had been as impossible to assign him an order of marching as Dingo. Unless he had been held by a string, he would not have kept it. His tin box strapped to his shoulder, his net in his hand, his large magnifying glass suspended to his neck, sometimes behind, sometimes in front, he scampered away among the high herbs, watching for orthopters or any other insect in tur, at the risk of being bit by some venomous serpent. During the first hour, Mrs. Weldon, uneasy, called him back 20 times. It was no use. Cousin Benedict, she finished by saying to him, I beg you very seriously not to go far away, and I urge you for the last time to pay attention to my entreaties. Meanwhile, cousin, replied the intractable entomologist, when I perceive an insect. When you perceive an insect, replied Mrs. Weldon, you would do well to let it go in peace, or you will put me under the necessity of taking your box away from you. Take away my box, cried Cousin Benedict, as if it were a question of snatching away his heart. Your box and your net, added Mrs. Weldon pitilessly. My net, cousin, and why not my glasses? You will not dare, no, you will not dare. Even your glasses, which I forgot. I thank you, Cousin Benedict, for reminding me that I have that means of making you blind, and in that way forcing you to be wise. This triple menace had the effect of making him keep quiet, this unsubmissive cousin, for about an hour. Then he began to go away again, and, as he would do the same, even without net, without box, and without glasses, they were obliged to let him do as he pleased. But Hercules undertook to watch him closely, which quite naturally became one of his duties, and it was agreed that he would act with Cousin Benedict as the latter would with an insect. That is, that he would catch him, if necessary, and bring him back as delicately as the other would with the rarest of the lepidopters. That rule made, they troubled themselves no more about Cousin Benedict. The little troop, it has been seen, was well armed and guarded itself carefully. But, as Harris repeated, there was no encounter to fear except with wandering Indians, and they would probably see none. At all events, the precautions taken would suffice to keep them respectful. The paths which wound across the thick forest did not merit that name. They were rather the tracks of animals than the tracks of men. They could only be followed with difficulty. So, In fixing the average distance that the little troop would make in a march of 12 hours at only 5 or 6 miles, Harris had calculated wisely. The weather, however, was very fine. The sun mounted toward the zenith, spreading in waves his almost perpendicular rays. On the plain this heat would be unbearable, Harris took care to remark, but under those impenetrable branches they bore it easily and with impunity. The greater part of the trees of this forest were unknown, as well to Mrs. Weldon as to her companions, black or white. However, an expert would remark that they were more remarkable for their quality than for their height. Here it was the banhinia, or ironwood. There the malampi, identical with the pterocarp, a solid and light wood fit for making the spoons used in sugar manufactories or oars, from the trunk of which exuded an abundant resin. Further on, fusticks, or yellow wood, well supplied with coloring materials, and lignum vitae, measuring as much as 12 feet in diameter, but inferior in quality to the ordinary lignum vitae. While walking, Dick Sand asked Harris the name of these different trees. "Then you have never been on the coast of South America?" Harris asked him before replying to his question. "Never," replied the novice. "Never, during my voyages, have I had occasion to visit these coasts, and to say the truth, I do not believe that anybody who knew about them has ever spoken to me of them." "But have you at least explored the coasts of Colombia, those of Chile, or of Patagonia?" "No, never." "But perhaps Mrs. Weldon has visited this part of the new continent?" asked Harris. "Americans do not fear voyages, and doubtless—" "No, Mr. Harris," replied Mrs. Weldon. "The commercial interests of my husband have never called him except to New Zealand, and I have not had to accompany him elsewhere. Not one of us, then, knows this portion of Lower Bolivia." "Well, Mrs. Weldon, you and your companions will see a singular country, which contrasts strangely with the regions of Peru, of Brazil, or of the Argentine Republic. Its flora and fauna would astonish a naturalist. Ah, we may say that you have been shipwrecked at a good place, and if we may ever thank chance. I wish to believe that it is not chance which has led us here, but—" "God, Mr. Harris." "God, yes, God," replied Harris, in the tone of a man who takes little account of providential intervention in the things of this world. Then, since nobody in the little troop knew either the country or its productions, Harris took a pleasure in naming pleasantly the most curious trees of the forest. In truth, it was a pity that, in Cousin Benedict's case, the entomologist was not supplemented by the botanist. If, up to this time, he had hardly found insects either rare or new, he might have made fine discoveries in botany. There was, in profusion, vegetation of all heights, the existence of which in the tropical forests of the New World had not been yet ascertained. Cousin Benedict would certainly have attached his name to some discovery of this kind. But he did not like botany. He knew nothing about it. He even, quite naturally, held flowers in aversion, under the pretext that some of them permit themselves to imprison the insects in their corollas and poison them with their venomous juices. At times, the forest became marshy. They felt underfoot quite a network of liquid threads, which would feed the affluents of the little river. Some of the rills, somewhat large, could only be crossed by choosing fordable places. On their banks grew tufts of reeds, to which Harris gave the name of papyrus. He was not mistaken, and those herbaceous plants grew abundantly below the damp banks. Then, the marsh passed, thickets of trees again covered the narrow roots of the forest. Harris made Mrs. Weldon and Dick Sand remark some very fine ebony trees, much larger than the common ebony tree, which furnish a wood much blacker and much stronger than that of commerce. Then there were mango trees, still numerous, though they were rather far from the sea. A kind of fur of white moss climbed them as far as the branches. Their thick shade and their delicious fruit made them precious trees, and meanwhile, according to Harris, not a native would dare to propagate the species. Whoever plants a mango tree dies, such is the superstitious maxim of the country. During the second half of this first day of the journey, the little troop, after the midday halt, began to ascend land slightly inclined. They were not as yet the slopes of the chain of the first plain, but a sort of undulating plateau which connected the plain with the mountain. There the trees, a little less compact, sometimes clustered in groups, would have rendered the march easier, if the soil had not been invaded by herbaceous plants. One might believe himself in the jungles of Oriental India. Vegetation appeared to be less luxuriant than in the lower valley of the little river, but it was still superior to that of the temperate regions of the Old or of the New World. Indigo was growing there in profusion, and, according to Harris, this leguminous plant passed with reason for the most usurping plant of the country. If a field came to be abandoned, this parasite, as much despised as the thistle or the nettle, took possession of it immediately. One tree seemed lacking in this forest, which ought to be very common in this part of the new continent. It was the caoutchouc tree. In fact, the ficus primoides, the Castaloa elastica, the Cecropia peltets, the Caulophora utilis, the Camarilla letifolia, and above all, the Siphonia elastica, which belong to different families, abound in the provinces of South America. And meanwhile, a rather singular thing, there was not a single one to be seen. Now, Dick Sand had particularly promised his friend Jack to show him some caoutchouc trees. So a great deception for the little boy, who figured to himself that gourds, speaking babies, articulate punchinellos, and elastic balloons grew quite naturally on those trees. He complained. "Patience, my good little man," replied Harris. "We shall find some of those caoutchoucs, and by hundreds, in the neighborhood of the farm." "Handsome ones, very elastic?" asked little Jack. "The most elastic there are. Hold, while waiting, do you want a good fruit to take away your thirst?" And, while speaking, Harris went to gather from a tree some fruits, which seemed to be as pleasant to the taste as those from the peach tree. "Are you very sure, Mr. Harris," asked Mrs. Weldon, "that this fruit can do no harm?" "Mrs. Weldon, I am going to convince you," replied the American, who took a large mouthful of one of those fruits. "It is a mango." And little Jack, without any more pressing, followed Harris's example. He declared that it was very good, those pears, and the tree was at once put under contribution. Those mangoes belong to a species whose fruit is ripe in March and April, others being so only in September, and, consequently, their mangoes were just in time. "Yes, it is good, good, good," said little Jack with his mouth full. "But my friend Dick has promised me caoutchoucs if I was very good, and I want caoutchoucs." "You will have them, Jack," replied Mrs. Weldon, "because Mr. Harris assures you of it." "But that is not all," went on Jack. "My friend Dick has promised me some other thing." "What then has friend Dick promised?" asked Harris, smiling. "Some hummingbirds, sir." "And you shall have some hummingbirds, my good little man, but farther on," replied Harris. The fact is that little Jack had a right to claim some of these charming creatures, for he was now in a country where they should abound. The Indians, who know how to weave their feathers artistically, have lavished the most poetical names on those jewels of the flying race. They call them either the rays or the hairs of the sun. Here, it is the little king of the flowers. There, the celestial flower that comes in its flight to caress the terrestrial flower. It is again the bouquet of jewels, which sparkles in the fire of the day. It can be believed that their imagination would know how to furnish a new poetical appellation for each of the 150 species which constitute this marvelous tribe of hummingbirds. Meanwhile, however numerous these hummingbirds might be in the forests of Bolivia, little Jack was obliged to still content himself with Harris's promise. According to the American, they were still too close to the coast, and the hummingbirds did not like these deserts so near the ocean. The presence of man did not frighten them at the hacienda. They heard nothing all day but their cry of terror and the murmur of their wings, similar to that of a spinning wheel. "Ah, how I should like to be there," cried little Jack. The surest method of getting there, to the hacienda of San Feliz, was not to stop on the road. Mrs. Weldon and her companions only took the time absolutely necessary for repose. The aspect of the forest already changed. Between the less crowded trees, large clearings opened here and there. The sun, piercing the green carpet, then showed its structure of red syenite granite, similar to slabs of lapis lazuli. On some heights the sarsaparilla abounded, a plant with fleshy tubercles, which formed an inextricable tangle. The forest, with the narrow paths, was better for them. Before sunset the little troop were about 8 miles from the point of departure. This journey had been made without accident, and even without great fatigue. It is true, it was the first journey on the march, and no doubt the following halting places would be rougher. By a common consent, they decided to make a halt at this place. The question then was, not to establish a real camp, but to simply organize a resting place. One man on guard, relieved every 2 hours, would suffice to watch during the night, neither the natives nor the deer being truly formidable. They found nothing better for shelter than an enormous mango tree, whose large branches, very bushy, formed a kind of natural veranda. If necessary, they could nestle in the branches. Only, on the arrival of the little troop, A deafening concert arose from the top of the tree. The mango served as a perch for a colony of gray parrots, prattling, quarrelsome, ferocious birds, which set upon living birds, and those who would judge them from their congeners which Europe keeps in cages would be singularly mistaken. These parrots jabbered with such a noise that Dick Sand thought of firing at them to oblige them to be silent or to put them to flight. But Harris dissuaded him, under the pretext that in these solitudes it was better not to disclose his presence by the detonation of a firearm. "Let us pass along without noise," he said, "and we shall pass along without danger." Supper was prepared at once, without any need of proceeding to cook food. It was composed of conserves and biscuit. A little rill, which wound under the plants, furnished drinkable water, which they did not drink without improving it with a few drops of rum. As to dessert, the mango was there with its juicy fruit, which the parrots did not allow to be picked without protesting with their abominable cries. At the end of the supper, it began to be dark. The shade rose slowly from the ground to the tops of the trees, from which the foliage soon stood out like a fine tracery on the more luminous background of the sky. The first stars seemed to be shining flowers, which twinkled at the end of the last branches. The wind went down with the night and no longer trembled in the branches of the trees. The parrots themselves had become mute. Nature was going to rest and inviting every living being to follow her in this deep sleep.